So very quickly, thanks for everyone for coming. This is our basement, but it's a nice basement, right? Right before COVID, I want to say we did 2 salons or 1. I can't remember. Nick, was it? Oh, it was 1. I've been saying 3, but I know that I'm exaggerating. I divide by 3. We did 1. And then COVID came along, and we haven't done anything since then. So this is our first salon. And, what do we want here? We want a place where we can share ideas. And most importantly, a lot of times when we're going to listen to some experts here. They're going to talk about stuff. They're going to talk about inflation, politics, the midterms, kind of related sort of issues of the confusion in the United States. But is that me? Yeah, that's my 21-year-old. He still needs guidance. But in any case, what we really want here is many times experts are very distant. They're on TV, they're on the radio, they're far away, they're on stage. We can't approximate them. And what we wanted from these salons was basically symmetry, not having a relationship that's asymmetric with the experts. And so this is what it is, the Ipsos Salon. And our plan, I would say every other month or so, we're going to have an event, not necessarily here. We might do it in other places. The next one's going to be on Ukraine. It's going to be a closed meeting, Chatham House rules, cool. We're going to have some cool guests as well. But the point is if you go, you can approximate the expert after the chat, after the session. You can go up there and talk with them, engage with them, et cetera. And that was our objective way back in 2019 when we had our 1 salon. So this is our second one, and we're kicking off this new sort of, this new year. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to our global CEO, Ben Page. He came here just for this salon with 59 people. But anyways, I want to welcome Ben Page.
Thank you. And this sort of thing is at the heart of what Ipsos is about, which is really about discussing openly with the joy of free speech that we have in the West, not in all the 90 countries we operate in, what's going on, and using expert understanding of public opinion, which we see as a French company with a British CEO. We are fully international. We are American in America. We are Brazilian in Brazil, we're French in France, we're Italian in Italy, etc. We are in 90 markets, 19,500 people. And just a few, as I am an opinion pollster, and we are now the only global research company run by a social scientist, which is what I could sort of on a good day call myself. On a bad day, God knows what I'd call myself. But I think on inflation, it's, as you will know if you're avid Ipsos followers, it's replaced COVID-19 as the biggest concern in the world. The work that we do for the central banks has shown, and indeed the work that we're, I think, publishing tomorrow shows that wage price spirals, which those of you who are old enough to remember the 1970s, and there aren't that many of you in here, but a few, don't seem to be happening. People are much more likely to say they'd move to a new employer than just go and ask for a pay rise, and it isn't really changing. The central bankers, when I presented this to them in Basel, to Jerome Powell and Christine Lagarde and all these people, of course, were delighted at this, and the fact that the central bankers themselves and interest rates are not currently being blamed for the situation. Most people blame the global economy or the war in Ukraine. But I think the challenge we face as we go, and we've just heard that the American economy is shrinking, is that the consumer expectations are behind where the reality is. And when you ask them what they think is going to happen next year, they have been consistently behind what has actually happened. So we're in this period where we are psychologically adjusting from a very long period of low inflation, many decision makers just not used to operating in an environment with double-digit inflation. And we don't quite know what's going to happen next. So events like today, and I'm sure the expert panel will tell us all the answers, but I think the fundamental challenge to me is one that in my own work, I think our Western societies, American society, European societies in particular, and the Latin Americans face, which is the loss of the future. And every time you think we've just got through one crisis, a new one emerges. But the challenge is that at the beginning of this century, only about 1 person in 10 in most Western countries expected their children to end up poorer than them. Before the pandemic, it had risen in the country I know best, Britain, to 45%. Very similar in France, the Gilets jaunes, etc. In large parts of America, similarly, angry and looking for somebody to blame. And the answer may be globalization. But either way, for policymakers, how we get through this, deal with, are you going to be, are you Hayekian or are you Keynesian in terms of your response? The panel will tell us, and Mallory will tell us in a minute. But certainly, I think the challenge is that all the evidence is that consumers, although they realize they're likely to be poorer, they may not realize quite how much poorer. And that is our central challenge for me. And I'm looking forward to answers from our expert panel on what will happen next. I will shut up, but on behalf of Ipsos, thank you so much for coming this evening.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Mallory Newell. I am a vice president within Ipsos's public affairs division. Within that, I'm one of our team leads for our public polling practice. Basically, what that means is it is my job to analyze a lot of this public opinion data on the topics that we're here to talk about today. Ipsos in the US works for a number of media outlets, as well as private sector companies that are sort of seeking to understand public opinion in the US right now, public opinion around the world. I am pleased to moderate our discussion today, and I'm joined by 2 expert panelists here, Jon Lieber and Justin Gest. Jon is a managing director for the Eurasia Group in the US. He focuses on kind of trying to understand US economic policy and political trends in the US, and advises a number of corporate and economic leaders on those topics. Justin is an associate professor at George Mason University, where he focuses on topics around politics and government. He has written a lot on demographic change and immigration. So I've got some questions for you both today, and then we will be taking some questions from you all as well. But thanks for being here, and thanks for joining us. All right, gentlemen, and you have 1 mic between the 2 of you, so we'll talk in a nice, orderly fashion. It's lovely. All right, so obviously we're here to discuss, as the name implied, the midterms, inflation, policy, and the implications of all of these things on society, right? So to start off, I'd like to hear a little bit more about, in your respective careers, your interests and what you're focused on. So Jon, I want to start with you. In this current climate, what is it that your clients who are focused on, kind of trying to understand political risk, the economic climate, what is it that your clients are focused on right now?
Great. Thank you, Mallory. Thanks so much for having me here today. So Eurasia Group is a political risk consulting firm. It was founded probably 2 decades ago by Ian Bremmer, who's a political scientist. And originally it was focused on the former Soviet states, Eurasia Group. And the reason was, as a lot of capital was flowing after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a lot of capital was flowing into these countries, and they were doing some crazy stuff with that. So investors didn't know, were they going to get paid back if they lent money? Were their assets going to be expropriated? And that caught on with the investment community, is really where Eurasia Group started, eventually caught on to the corporate community as well. And over time, Eurasia Group was built out to include Latin America, Asia, the Middle East. And since the financial crisis, our client base has become a lot more interested in developed markets, Europe and the United States. And the United States right now, after 2016, is an incredibly hot area for political risk. So, what we track are policy developments here that will affect the investment decisions of our clients, a lot of which, our kind of canonical client is like a macro hedge fund who cares about interest rates, exchange rates, and stuff like that. We've got other people who are tracking really specific policy developments. Is the US going to subsidize the semiconductor industry or not? And then we have a lot of clients who really care about structural issues in the US. Is the US going to be an investable market? Oh my God, the Supreme Court is so incredibly polarized. What is that going to mean? Is Donald Trump going to be president again? Are they going to kick everybody out? I mean, there's a lot of big questions. So the US is starting to, some of our clients, and I'm not sure I necessarily agree with this, but to some of our clients, the US is starting to look more like an emerging market, especially than, definitely more than it has at any point in the last 50 years. And that raises a lot of questions about the political context of their investing strategies. So that's what I try to do, is give them a good sense of, or best sense I can, of the direction of travel on policy risk. And we work a lot on foreign policy because a lot of my colleagues are very focused on their respective regions. And it's a pretty interesting time to be doing this.
Absolutely. And Justin, as I mentioned, you have written and you have focused your career on tribalization, on immigration, and around demographic change in the US. A lot of forces that I think kind of feed into this and what we're talking about today. So I'd love to just hear from you a little bit about how do these individual forces affect our current climate?
Sure. Thanks, Mallory. And thank you guys for having me here today. It's always exciting to be here. And I must say that Ipsos has been a brilliant partner for me intellectually to exchange ideas with. And so, while I'm up here in front of you guys today as today's expert, I must tell you that I learn as much from my Ipsos colleagues as I think they learn from me. It's been a really wonderful exchange. So in my work, beyond my professorial duties, obviously at a university where I teach and also oversee a lot of graduate students, I also advise a number of government agencies and nonprofit groups, and there's a number of questions on people's minds right now. In my space, demographic change is obviously very important, and from my view, demographic change inside the United States, not just with shrinking fertility rates and aging that's happening in this country, which are fundamental to our economic prospects, but also the changing racial and ethnic distribution in the country as well. And I think that if you want to understand our politics, the overshadowing effect of people's concern about the majority-minority future of this country is simply unignorable at this point. It's a very complicated reality, and I'm happy to double-click on any of these thoughts as we progress here today. But I think that discomfort, anxiety, eager anticipation of these demographic trends are really litmus tests for people's partisan politics today. And they explain much of the identity politics and culture wars that are defining the American political environment right now, and also infusing those of our peer countries elsewhere in the West. And so, this is definitely something that's in the back of my mind, and unpacking what that future and people's prospects and expectations for that future will be. There's a lot of status threat. It's affecting economic decisions and residential choices. So we're observing it pretty carefully. What we're also seeing, I think, is people questioning the sort of racialization of American politics. Heretofore, American politics was not actually all that racialized up until around 2000. Muslims broke for President George W. Bush in 2000. Asian Americans broke for the elder President Bush in 1992. George W. Bush actually nearly split Latinos in 2004. But over the last 15 to 18 years, we've seen the progressive racialization of the parties, where members of ethnic and racial minorities in the United States have broke overwhelmingly for the Democrats, and the Republican Party has become more homogeneously white at a time when the country is becoming less homogeneously white. Those trends are being questioned now with the growth and ascendance of a Latino electorate that may be more up for grabs, and that's certainly of interest to both Democrats and Republicans, as you might imagine. And I think that more broadly, people are also very concerned about the shredding of a national social fabric. I think that not only are debates polarizing and I think divisive, but it's unclear what the effect of these debates and divides are on interpersonal relations. The extent to which we have interpersonal contact with one another. These are the kinds of things that are on people's minds, and this is certainly on my mind as well.
Great, thanks. John, I want to circle back to something that you mentioned, which is that some of your clients and folks that you work with are contemplating if the US is starting to look more like an emerging market, right? I'd love to kind of dive into a little bit about why that is and perhaps the implications around this, as you described it, institutional decay that we're seeing or experiencing in the US.
Yeah, and this is something that we're giving a lot of thought to, and I'm not really sure I have a really good fleshed out sense of this yet, but like, what does it mean to be an emerging market versus a developed market? Well, generally, policy outcomes are less predictable. You have wild regime change from one person to the next. Look at Brazil, where you just get, you get one regime and the policy direction flip-flops and you get a totally different set of policies coming out. You look at Ecuador. The current president there is trying to Bitcoinize the currency. And these kind of things are unpredictable and they create risk for a lot of clients like ours. And I think that a lot of our clients, particularly foreign clients, they follow the news flow here, they read the same things that I read, and they see all the same things you're seeing: division, polarization, less predictability, in between regime shifts. I mean, on the one hand, President Obama is trying to regulate greenhouse gases, puts the US into the Paris Climate Accords, and then tries to put together a trading bloc with 40% of global GDP under a kind of a rubric of countering China. And then President Trump comes in and pulls out of all those things. And then President Biden comes back and tries to do them again. But suddenly now the US is a less predictable partner in foreign policy, and it's a less predictable player in economic policy. So there's a lot of questions about how does the US that created the post-war global order project power? How do you have a rules-based kind of trading system if the most important country that kind of assembled that isn't really interested in doing that anymore? And if you're going to be investing into the United States, do these policy shifts and the polarization start to affect the types of decisions you make? And to give you an example, 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court made a decision in a case called West Virginia versus EPA that essentially signaled the Supreme Court's intention to radically rethink how much deference they give to executive branch agencies when interpreting laws. And basically asking Congress, hey, Congress, if you want EPA to do something, you have to be really prescriptive in what you're asking them to do. And if you're not, well, we're not going to give them that much leeway to interpret that for you. So what that means is it's going to be a lot harder for regulators to regulate at the federal level. In the absence of regulation, the states aren't going to stand still. I mean, we are a confederation of 50 states, the District of Columbia, and California wants to lead on climate policy. And if the federal government's not going to do it, California will. So if you're looking at the policy environment in the US, suddenly it doesn't look like a national market the way it did 2 years ago. Suddenly it looks like you potentially have all these different regulatory regimes you have to start thinking about. Now, in some ways, this isn't new, right? The states have different labor laws. There's some states are right-to-work states. Some states make it easier to form a union. But in other ways, there's some new things happening that I think a lot of our clients are trying to understand about how this kind of polarization and change is affecting their decision-making and how they think about the US as a contiguous market.
I think that's really interesting. You just mentioned that in many ways this isn't new, right? And to what extent is sort of what we're seeing a continuation of broader trends that have developed over time? Obviously we have an election coming up in November. We have the midterm elections, and many are forecasting that the Republicans will sweep the House of Representatives. The Senate remains kind of a toss-up, up for grabs, but in many ways that kind of follows historical patterns, right? The party that is out of power, in this case the Republican Party, makes gains in a midterm year. We've seen that happen in 2010 after President Obama was elected in 2008. We've seen that happen throughout the course of history. And so I have to wonder, to what extent is this November just going to kind of look like that wave where the party out of power kind of makes gains and it's just following a historical pattern? However, we are at this point in time where it feels like there are a lot of uncertainties. There is a lot of things at play. And so I'm wondering if you can both just provide some insight into how these trends that you've discussed, inflation as a main issue, demographic change, this uncertainty that you're seeing, how does that connect with the midterms in November and what voters may or may not do or what we can expect?
Sure. I mean, there's nothing in the upcoming midterm cycle that I think would interrupt those historical trends of the general election victor losing seats in both congressional houses, except the possibility of Trump declaring his candidacy. So there was thought initially that the revocation of Roe versus Wade could lead to very strong Democratic turnout, along with the gun violence that we've seen in the United States. I think inflation has counteracted all of that. In my estimation, the economy is, let's look at Ipsos data. The economy is superseding everything in terms of issue salience right now. And so I simply think that it has been overwhelmed by economic instability and concern over those things. However, if former President Trump does enter the race, or it just seems inevitable, then Democrats could potentially mobilize people in such a way to counteract the midterm shellacking that everyone's expecting. The reason why, of course, that we see these trends is really psychological. It's all about motivation. And the loser from the previous election is more motivated to reject that party in the next election. And the winner, the victor party, is usually more complacent. And so it's really a motivation game. And so if the Democrats can leverage President Trump's potential entry into the race, then they actually have a chance of at least dampening what otherwise could be a severe shellacking that people are expecting could be at historical proportions. But that's from my angle.
I would just comment on kind of the historical perspective here. I mean, I think we are in a unique era where you look at the House of Representatives, it's flipped over control, and I don't know how many times, but in the last 20 years, it flipped over control more times than it did in the previous 40. So we came out of this era of really relative stable politics in the US, where Democrats dominated the House all the way up until the 1994 wave election that brought the Newt Gingrich Republicans in. And now, since then, politics have been more polarized, and that reflects kind of maybe there's some racial sorting and demographic and geographic sorting that happened over that time period. But it's just it is a lot more volatile. You have the Republican Party, which is a fundamentally minoritarian party that does not win a majority of votes. I think it won one time. Thank you. And so in the last 30 years is the only time they've won a majority of votes. Yet they've pursued this electorally efficient strategy that allows them to not quite dominate the Senate, but have a better than even chance of winning the Senate in any given year. Same thing in the House, and allows them to kind of hack the Electoral College in the same way, and has given them this really dominant position on the Supreme Court as well. So I think you're right. There are historical trends that will dictate the midterm races this year. But it's also, we are in a unique period of kind of upheaval, and there's going to be this power shift between the two parties going forward, just because they've aligned themselves that way.
The polarization is creating, obviously, this political or legislative paralysis. And so it's increasingly easy, I think, for opposition parties to simply say, oh, well, the party in power can't do anything. Well, of course they can't do anything because no one's compromising with each other. And the margins are so small that you don't have enough to actually overwhelm it. So that, I think, is probably something that we're going to see for a while.
Okay, well, that's cheerful and upbeat. Let's look forward for a moment. I'm curious to hear, obviously we know what's at stake. It is well established in Ipsos data, as you pointed out, Justin, that the economy, inflation, and price increases have just completely replaced COVID-19 as the main issue. It is really sort of the vacuum that's sucking all of the air out of the room, right? And that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. We know that, right? So let's look forward. What are some solutions that people are working on to address what we are facing in this current climate, whether it is to address, economic pressures and price pressures, whether it is to address the feeling of instability, or the sense of insecurity perhaps created by migration patterns and demographic change?
Sure. So obviously conflict gets a lot of attention. In the political sphere, there's a lot of conflict. So everything we read about is when the two parties are at odds with each other. But just looking at Congress, there are a lot of things happening that are relatively positive, right? So you did a big infrastructure bill. No one talks about it. President gets no credit for it, but it happened. And it was a significant accomplishment. It'd been kind of floating out there for a decade. They passed the best bill they could do to reform gun laws, to prevent mass shootings in the future. May or may not make a difference. We'll see what happens. There is a law that's probably going to pass later this year to reform what's known as the Electoral Count Act. And any political junkies in the US who followed the insurrection on January 6th may have heard of this. And it cleans up some of the ambiguities that President Trump tried to exploit on that day that led to them, people trying to hang Mike Pence. And I think one other thing I would point to is I don't think this happens, but in terms of solutions to sort of the big structural challenges that plague America, social media reform. I mean, there's an active effort going on. Lawmakers are talking about this in a way they didn't 5 years ago because they've recognized the role social media plays in poisoning the minds of young Americans and driving people apart. And I think that the solutions may not be a good fit for the problem, but at least they're talking about it as a problem, and I think it is a problem. I think social media is responsible for some of the uniqueness of the era that we're in.
Before we move on to Justin, what might those reforms look like?
There's a few. So you've got two big efforts. One, there's about 6 or 7 bills between the House and the Senate that would either break up the big tech companies, make their business models illegal, or create more accountability for what people are posting on these platforms and the consequences of that. And then also within the Biden administration, there's a big push on antitrust enforcement. The woman that's the head of the Federal Trade Commission right now wrote a paper, kind of burst into fame by writing this paper about applying a novel theory of antitrust enforcement to tech companies. And so you could break them. The predominant legal theory in the US behind antitrust enforcement is that you have to prove consumer harm. Like for there to be a monopoly, the only way there's a monopoly is if it hurts people and then we'll act. How do you prove consumer harm when you're giving away a product for free? So she comes in with a new legal theory that basically allows her to say, well, this is about more than consumer harm. And so therefore, we're going to charge after these tech companies. Just this week, they filed to block the acquisition by Facebook of a small Meta of a small VR company because they didn't want Meta to dominate the VR space. So I'm not sure that's a good solution for the problem, but they're talking about it. And I think that just recognizing that, concentration of economic power in social media is a force in the US today is a step towards a solution.
Thanks. Yeah, look, the content regulation is interesting because it relates to misinformation. What I'm particularly fascinated by, though, is the way that the internet and the sharing of information on the internet has created the atomization of people's information resources. We've all read about siloing and sort of disconnecting from other groups. I don't think that any changes to the internet business and tech business is actually going to change that. If you have more companies out there that are prevented from creating trusts, you're still going to create information subcultures where people are not exposed to other groups. And that's why what I'm really looking for from a social perspective is intergroup contact. I think that is truly the key to overcoming polarization. I think it's the key towards building a culture of inclusion and reducing the sense of threat, both status threat and cultural threat and economic threat that sometimes emerges when we misunderstand other groups. The problem is that every force in American society right now, and really more globally, is reinforcing the boundaries between us. So we are increasing. We've already been, segregated residentially by race and ethnicity. We are now seeing increasing, brutal evidence, frankly, of partisan segregation. And now we are basically informationally segregated as well. And I don't think that's going to change. And so I think it has to actually become, and we're talking about solutions, prospectively. I think that, connecting with one another across these kinds of boundaries is going to be key. And I think it's about recognizing where different organizations have a role to play in this, because it can't just be government, especially in a very anti-government country like the United States and limited government country like the United States. The government can only have so much power. It comes down to the private sector and also civil society organizations to cultivate connectivity between the population to the extent that that's of value. And I wonder if that's actually going to emerge and sort of emerge inside of the diversity and inclusion work that we see. Because I think that this is quite pivotal to actually improving everything from employee relations to intergroup relations in society. As it relates to inflation, though, I would love to share this. We're talking prospectively, so I can't prove this. But there is really interesting evidence that's coming out that I'm examining quite closely about the way that inflation connects with demographic change and immigration. So a very unheralded explanation for today's inflation, beneath oil prices and everything else that everyone talks a lot about, is the complete shuffling of a population that had took place during the pandemic. Many of you are working from home right now. Some of you may have decided to move to a place like Utah or perhaps to a beachside town, in the Florida Panhandle. I don't know, but many people did that. And they moved to places with recreational amenities and completely shuffled the population accordingly. When they did that, they were consuming resources, and those local societies that were receiving a lot of population did not have the labor to provide the goods and services that these people needed, which drove up prices for those goods and services. And that kind of reshuffling has taken place. How that changes is going to be interesting. Well, before I actually get there, they also could not attract labor to satisfy that demand because immigration internationally was completely cut. And so it is unclear whether, and I think it's unlikely, that there's going to be any kind of influx of foreign workers in the United States because of the legislative paralysis that we've been discussing. And it's unclear whether workers are going to continue to move to meet that labor demand in other places. But it's also unclear whether a potential recession, which if you've been reading the news today, we might be entering recession territory here in the US, whether a potential recession actually alleviates those wage pressures because those people are going to be consuming less goods. Right now, consumer demand is really strong. It's roaring, completely in the face of all the evidence. What we're expecting to see is a drop-off of consumer demand in the next year or two, but that has not happened yet. If it continues longer than we expect, those inflationary pressures may persist.
So I established I'm a researcher, right? As a researcher in a room of pollsters and public opinion professionals, I have to ask, particularly in a time where there is sort of declining institutional trust and people aren't necessarily trusting the information that is out there and available. How can public opinion data help illuminate what is going on right now? What are your clients? What are your students? What should members of the public be looking at to better understand what's going on?
So this is a perfect question, frankly, in response to my point about intergroup contact and the siloization of our society informationally. The work that Ipsos and peer organizations do is pivotal to this, because we are a mirror, effectively, for society. We are holding a mirror up to ourselves and saying, this is actually what we look like. These are the trends that are going on right now. And it reflects not just who we are, but also who everyone is, right? Not just who we are personally, but everyone. So we are able to actually learn what our fellow men and women are thinking in society when when we were otherwise siloed from those opinions. And that is so critical in a time when we are cut off. And I think that people marvel. When I do my field work recently, I did a bunch of field work for a forthcoming book, and I never heard so many people use the phrase, "I live in a bubble." And these are folks that aren't like part of some kind of random subculture, right? They're just generally average folks, like you wouldn't think are actually radical or somehow exceptional. People are aware that they live in a bubble because they're being confronted with the opinions and views of others who they otherwise do not have much contact with. And it's actually critical that we provide information about how other people feel, so that actually realizing that you're in a bubble is a good thing. It's actually, I think, a step towards progress. It's thinking that you own the world and everyone agrees with you. That's really bad, because then there's no pluralism. And I think that pluralism is truly the key to overcoming a lot of the challenges that we're identifying.
Public opinion polling is like so core to our work because we really care about, part of our job is forecasting what the heck's going on out there. And the way we understand that is the barometer we get from public opinion polling. And it's really important to have good public opinion polling. And so I consume a lot of polls. And there's almost like an embarrassment of riches of polls out there right now. And you guys do amazing work. And every week I get the Ipsos presidential public opinion poll, and I send it around to my colleagues, and I'm like, Biden's up, Biden's down. And it really informs how we think about the direction of travel. But then there's also, 538 has this great good use of polling or bad use of polling, right? And it's a really helpful thing to think about because you have to put in context the numbers you're reading. New York Times Siena poll 3 weeks ago the New York Times had a week of articles coming out of this poll, subdividing, I think it was probably 1,000 people were polled. They're talking about how young people feel about Biden, how Hispanics feel about Biden, and it launches 1,000 think pieces based on what 30 Hispanics said they felt about President Biden. So having that in the right context, understanding it is really important and it shapes the entire narrative of what we think and people who kind of talk about this stuff all the time think about what's going on in the world, and making sure that it's high quality stuff is really, really, really critical. One of the things I love that you guys do in the presidential polling, the approval tracker, is breaking out the partisan issues by partisanship. So suddenly in your last poll, crime had risen to 11% concern among Democrats as the number 3 issue. That to me was interesting. Chris Jackson would probably tell me that's just a blip and I should wait and see how it is over a couple of weeks. But it was interesting, and this informs how I see things and and it definitely informs how the partisans act. So the way that Republicans are really pushing this crime issue right now because they sense that it's a rising issue in African American communities and in the suburbs, and so they want to push this. So this stuff really, really, really matters, and getting it right is really important.
But no pressure.
Yeah.
Okay, again, I'm curious to be a little bit more forward-looking here, and I'd love to hear from both of you about, with all that's at stake right now and all that we've discussed right now, what do you think we can expect in future election cycles? Is it going to be continued instability? Is it going to be continued partisan shifts that we see at a more frequent rate? Basically, I'm asking, is this our new normal? I know that term got thrown around a lot during the pandemic, but
at some level, there are quiet shifts in the American political landscape that happen all the time, and there are misdiagnoses of problems. In 2006, 2004, they were talking about a permanent Republican majority because President Bush had this inroads with Hispanics who were a growing part of the population. Turns out that was totally wrong. Hispanics flipped strongly the other direction over the subsequent elections, and everybody kind of missed that. And then in 2012, Republicans' diagnosis was, we're doing terrible with Hispanics, and we better do more to kind of court them. That led to this failed effort of doing an immigration reform bill in 2013, and then Donald Trump comes in and totally scrambles the political scene by just rejecting anything about immigration reform and winning the presidency anyway. So I think it's really hard to see the shifts as they're coming. But this is an incredibly polarized country. The states, based on something Justin said, that you got rural states and more urbanized states, and then you've got kind of the states in between where all the presidential elections are being fought right now. That's probably going to be true for the next couple of cycles until demographic shifts catch up with the parties. And I think there's an argument that's being made that Democrats have taken Hispanic support perhaps for granted for too long. You look at second-generation Hispanics who have English primary households, they look more like white voters. And so that's an important shift that if the Democrats don't kind of wake up to that, they're going to find out that the majority they think they have is probably not a durable one. And so, I think that these shifts are going to take us several cycles to play out. The Republican Party at the same time is becoming much more, it's relying on a smaller share of the population to win elections.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't, they got lucky in the 2010 election cycle, and they got really lucky in the 2020 election cycle because they were able to control a number of the redistrictings that happened, which kind of helped cement some of their gains in the House. So that has a 10-year legacy. And but eventually, I think this is going to catch up with them.
Unless Democrats from urban centers and coastal states start moving to battleground states in mass.
To Asheville and Panama City
Right.
and Provo. Yeah,
Right.
which is happening. So there's both status and status quo and change, right? So there are certain factors that are going to lead to stalemates, right? So one of them is gerrymandering, which we haven't used the word yet, but it's basically underneath everything that John and I have been saying today. and polarization. Neither of those are going anywhere, which means that there are fewer toss-up states. You're not going to have huge swings, I think, in one direction or the other, and you're not going to have like tons of legislative progress. So from the change perspective, the spaces that I would watch are, what does the Democratic Party and the Republican Party do? These elections there is agency from the parties. And the Democrats, confronted with a Republican Party that swung very hard to the right, historically hard to the right, have decided, at least it seems to be flirting with, moving harder to the left, which goes against a lot of political strategy, which would normally say, maybe you should move to the center and try to capture disaffected moderates, to the extent that any of us think those people exist anymore. I happen to think they do. Even, it's just not necessarily the way we always study moderates. So the Democrats have apparently chosen not to do that, though, and they're moving harder to the left now. A lot of these elections, are going to be driven, I think, by the choices, particularly the national elections in 2024, where you don't have big structural factors, and be determined by that. When Biden was elected, I think that people were seeking a sort of an adult in the room, as it's been phrased, and they were looking for someone who was technically a technocrat. They were looking for someone who was actually going to manage affairs, a manager, someone who's going to bring functionality back to government. A little bit of stability would be nice for a change. They got someone who was incredibly stable, so stable that most people think he's like in a coma or like moribund. And so now the American public is like, you can't be satisfied. First you want entertainment, now you want, it's impossible to satisfy. Now what Democrats seem to want is a fighter. That's not Joe Biden. And so it is highly likely that you see some kind of regime change at the top of the Democratic Party, independent of how the next 2 years go. And where they go with that fighter, if that fighter is appealing to people in the center, is going to make a big difference to their electoral prospects, I think, in the future. If and when Republicans take power in 2023 in the House and or the Senate, they're going to reveal how they behave, and they're going to reveal what kind of party they are. If they're going to impeach, President Biden on, for no reason, effectively, because there's already plans to impeach him, they just haven't figured out why yet. That is going to affect people's views of the Republican Party and create an opportunity for Democrats. And so, so much of this, we can sit here and predict, but it's going to there is a lot of agency involved by these parties in terms of who they are and what their image they're giving out. Demographically, we're aging quickly. Baby boomers are going to be retiring. That's going to put new fiscal pressures on an economy, on a market that is not getting younger because we are not bringing in more immigrants, who are the sources of higher fertility rates in the United States, even if marginally higher. The Latino shift is really fascinating, but what we're, I think, revealing is that we are not a country that is divided by race. We are a country that is divided by color. And what I mean by that is that just because you are Latino doesn't necessarily mean that you identify as brown somehow or as a person of color. Many of this shift that we're seeing amongst Latinos are among Latinos who self-identify as white. We see it in Ipsos research. I'm working on this right now, actually, with several of my colleagues who are here today. And it is a marginal change over those folks who are not having a minority experience as Americans. So even if they recognize themselves as Hispanics and as Latinos, they are having a life that is characterized by metrics that we would otherwise see in white people. Also, we are seeing the tripling of mixed race people in the United States, whether because more people are intermarrying, which they are, but also because people feel more comfortable self-identifying as biracial. Those folks, 80% of them, have one parent that is self-identifying as white. They also may self-identify as white in the future. And if that happens, it's really colorism in the United States that really starts to change things. It's not necessarily about where you're from or where your family is from. It is about whether you pass to meet this historic, ambiguous, and completely artificial understanding of whiteness. So these are the kind of trends that I'm looking at, but I'm more just watching what actors are doing in order to anticipate the future, because I do think there are a lot of decisions down the line at critical junctures to watch.
And there's also that big open question mark, which I think you both alluded to, of whether Donald Trump runs for president again, when he announces, and sort of who the figurehead of the Republican Party is as well. On that note, let's take some questions.
I thought you were going to say, on that note, let's have cocktails. All right.
Well, yes. Questions and cocktails. All are welcome. Feel free to raise a hand, and either myself or Mina will jump up and share a microphone. Yeah.
Hi. I just kind of wandered in as a member of the general public, so this is a completely naive question. But it's bothering to me that racial categories, and you haven't mentioned the LBGTQ, but there are very limited notions of what are demographic categories. And it seems to me that you could pick a bunch of other categories, like, just pull something out of the air that matters to me. Do you drive or do you not drive? Are you well educated or not well educated? Maybe those are hard to measure, maybe because everyone's being trained to report demographic categories in the standard way, but it might be more insightful to break up the population based on other categories. That's my thought.
Sure, it's an excellent point. I mean, so, we can self-identify in a variety of ways out there, and the ways that we currently study race and ethnicity and a variety of other demographic attributes is arbitrary in the sense that they're quite constructed. Researchers have to decide, and in many ways, we are sort of standing on the shoulders of questionable giants, dubious giants who made the decision to divvy up society according to the racial standards that we have today. But this is actually a great opportunity to showcase recent Ipsos research that I was lucky enough to participate in, where we were really conscious of what are the dividing lines, the fault lines of American society, so that we understand what are the identities that matter. And we had hypotheses that maybe education and therefore also class was connected, maybe nativity, whether you're born here or not. We didn't check whether people drive,
But that could be area type, whether you live in an urban versus
we
suburban and rural.
And we checked that too, right? Remember, we checked urbanicity versus rurality to see what was really driving the divisions between people. And what we found is that, remarkably, so first off, religion and race are still prominent divides in American society. There's no question about it, they're there. But what really blew our minds was that partisanship actually superseded all of them in terms of the way that people feel a sense of distance from their fellow citizens. And so this is a really powerful trend, and I think it was sort of implied by a lot of my remarks about partisan division and polarization. But partisan differences, in many ways are becoming our new religion. And that is why we focus so carefully and heavily on party ID, race, and also religion to some extent. It's because that's actually what matters for people right now.
You can also use sort of where you get your news as a proxy, but in many ways it kind of boils down to your partisanship, right? Where you get your news, do you listen to Fox or watch Fox News versus MSNBC? It sort of tells the same story, just a different spin on it.
And if anyone's interested in that research, it was actually published in Time magazine, and so in case you missed the Ipsos newsletter about it, you can check it out.
You're my hype man. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go Chris
And we can
back
send
here
you an
and
email
then
as well.
over
Yeah.
here.
So to the point about going hard left and hard right, today we saw an announcement of potential third party. Is that a reality? Is that something that can actually last, or is this one day and one day out?
I just think third parties are going to struggle in the U.S. for structural reasons, right? Like, if third parties could succeed here, you'd have independent third-party governors. You'd have independent third-party mayors. Maybe there's a few. There's no governors. I mean, the structure, the party apparatus goes from is baked in the cake, from the United States Senate to like the local county rec hall, like everywhere you go. It's just like really built in. The branding value in terms of fundraising and getting people to vote for you. Grover Norquist has a line where he wants to make sure that if somebody who stumbles into the ballot booth drunk knows that Republicans are the ones who stand for taxes, and so just vote tax cuts. So just vote for the R, no matter how drunk you are, because that's the thing you care about. And like that branding value really matters a lot, I think in our reality. So I would heavily sell any efforts to form a third party in this country, and I wish they'd succeed. I wish them luck. You do have occasional people like Ross Perot. Michael Bloomberg could have been a potential person to do this, who can self-finance and create a personality cult that's big enough to make an impact on the national level. But it's really hard for these guys to win.
All you need to know is that Donald Trump, who effectively created a third party, chose to fit himself inside of the Republican Party. He wasn't a Republican at the time, right? And well, he is the Republican Party now, right? And so that tells you, I think, everything you need to know. It's also, I think, because Donald Trump is cheaper than Michael Bloomberg or Ross Perot, and I don't think we've seen his taxes, so we don't actually even know how rich he is. But he didn't want to self-fund, right? And so if you look at successful independents, they're all at the national level, well, not even successful, but prominent independents are at the national level or at statewide. The American political system is all the way local. And a third party is going to have a really hard time scaling anywhere. So you could see maybe like a prominent governor like a Jesse Ventura or an Angus King in Maine, emerge. Arnold Schwarzenegger was effectively an independent, but he also went inside of the Republican Party. You can see those emerge, and I would say the upside for this new party forward might be, a governorship, but to expect them to have the kind of apparatus that makes a political party what it is in the United States, as John said, it is baked into the cake here.
I'd love to hear more about your comments on immigration. It feels like it's the elephant in the room. It feels like it's part of the answer to the supply chain challenges, with Americans waiting a year to order a couch and going into stores and finding empty shelves, something that we used to associate with the former Soviet Union, not something you would think of as, American capitalism. And it also seems to be the answer to a lot of the labor shortages in this country. So why isn't it that why haven't those things converged to a groundswell that we should be doing something about immigration, and that is the answer to some of our greatest challenges right now?
We have the groundswell. 70% of Americans, about 2/3 of Americans, believe that immigration is on balance, good for the country. The same share believe that we should either keep immigration constant or increase it. Here's the problem. The third of the country that is not believe that immigration is good, or that believes that we should decrease immigration, for them it is their number one issue in many cases, right? Or a significant share is in the top 3. For the 70% of the country who actually believe in immigration or want to see more of it and agree with what you just said, it's number 12. It's number 10, it's number 13. There's other issues: healthcare, climate change, COVID, the economy, inequality, racial justice, name it. Then immigration comes down. But there is a hardcore of Americans that believes that immigration is the greatest threat facing the country right now. And that fuels Republican turnout and mobilization. And it's something that Donald Trump tapped into, and the party is not going to let go of anytime soon. You want to follow up?
I just think there's immigration for, everything that we value, and the fact that most of us can trace our families back to immigrants who helped build this country. And then there's immigration selfishly from an economic standpoint, about getting goods off boats, about getting, luggage where it's supposed to go. I mean, just basic functioning of our economy. So I guess I'm just surprised that the combination of corporate America and citizens frustrated with the economy hasn't led to some kind of change around labor.
And corporate America has been behind immigration reform for a long time, and it hasn't been enough. And one of the reasons why are these public opinion trends. What I'll just add is that the other thing is that, like we talked about agency, right, of movements. They also have a role to play, and the immigrant rights movement in the United States, I think, has made a number of mistakes over the years. They have, they have gone, I think, too far, and they have eschewed matters of management and control, and that matters to a lot of Americans. And that has, I think, radicalized the opposition to immigration in the way we've seen, rather than talking about immigration from a national interest perspective.
I have a question. Can I ask a
Cliff.
question? Okay, let me challenge you there. It's a good challenge. It's a soft one. So how do you respond to this? Immigration is not about immigration in the US. It's about color. So that 70% you said, I agree with your point about the minority being the number one issue. Totally agree. But that 70%, what percent of that 70% really prefers, I don't know, immigrants from Norway versus immigrants from somewhere else? How do you react to that? Is that true? Is that a true statement or not?
It's 100. It's basically undeniable at this point. So there's been extensive research.
So what I just said is undeniable.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
And so the other way of looking at it is that what you just said is well established. But so yeah, there's been extensive research that shows that it's not about economic threat. It's principally about culture threat.
All right, we've got, I think, 2 questions over here. Warren, go ahead.
So, you know, I've been thinking about this. So I've been working for about 30 years now, good or bad. And one of the most interesting things about the particular 30-year period that I've worked in is that I think a real distinguishing factor, sort of a consistent factor, beyond temporary moments like inflation, pandemics, things like that, is the proliferation of technology and the resulting globalization that occurred. And you know, it's my sense that the sort of American political apparatus that's been in power sort of throughout my life really doesn't understand how to function in a world where we're not the only game in town anymore. And neither does our society as a result. So I'm sort of curious, to what extent did those kind of macro elements play into kind of our current situation and ultimately the issues that you study?
Like, you mean technological change and trade? Is that?
Yeah, like the proliferation of technology, what that meant to the rise of many global players, and then our ability to function in a world where we're not the only game in town.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure this answers your question, but like I think a lot of people's kind of halcyon view of the 50s and 60s in the US is based on this kind of naive acceptance of the fact that like the rest of the world was a disaster. And the U.S. was surging with this population boom and this incredible free market that could take capital and put it in innovation and create things and create jobs, and then created this global order, this global trading system that could deliver prosperity globally. And then at some point, that all kind of started to change. And you could blame that. You could say we went too far, that it was really hard to absorb 2 billion people in China and in South Asia into that system, because they started to compete against Americans, drive down wages, and cost people jobs. And I think that that's a huge part of the backlash we've seen over the last decade to globalization. And that's a story both of technological change, because a lot of jobs have been automated away, and it's a story of technology giving us access to just unfiltered information, a lot of which is just not true, and kind of stimulates your brain in really ways that are socially destructive, antisocial ways. And I think immigration is a big part of this story too, where it's like people perceive opportunities drying up and they blame the immigrants. So all of these things I think all of these things explain Donald Trump, right? And all of these things explain why both parties are becoming more populist. And what does it mean to be populist? It means that you're just giving people what they want. You're telling people what they want to hear, whether or not it's a good idea, and you're delivering that as a policy platform. And you're seeing that on both sides. And I would argue the Democrats historically have been the more populist party, with more, because their constituents are more labor unions and they're not as concerned with kind of the efficient operation of the economy. And the Republicans now are by far the more populist party. I mean, I just think the Republicans aren't thinking 2 steps ahead when they put out policy ideas anymore. And I say that as a reforming Republican. So I think that, I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think that these factors are all kind of a miasma that's causing the situation that we're in today.
So I know that we have more questions, and I very much appreciate that. But I do want to give people a chance to get up, to have some drinks and food, and keep talking amongst yourselves. And ask questions while you're doing that. Yeah, of course. So thank you all for joining us today. I want to extend a huge thank you to Jon and to Justin for chatting. A big thank you to Ben for being here and joining us all the way from the UK, and to Cliff as well. Thank you all. Take care.